When the Super Nintendo launched in 1991, I was immediately smitten by its game library. Super Mario World was a hoot, and Super Castlevania 4 is one of my favorite games ever. F-Zero was a racing masterpiece, and ActRaiser was a beautiful blend of action and RPG elements. Pilot Wings was a stunning showpiece for Mode 7, and while far from arcade perfect, Final Fight was still a heck of a fun time. But as great as the initial volley of titles showed the machine's promise, it was 1992 where the Super Nintendo really began to shine. It went from a console with loads of potential to one that demanded your attention. In this episode, we will take a trip down memory lane and cover some of my favorite games from 1992 for Nintendo's 16-bit monster. We are going to be talking about run and guns, fighters, racing games, beat-em-ups, shooters, and even a sports game. Over a dozen software titles in total. We have some real classics in this one, so let's get started. Our first game is Super Smash TV, released in February 1992 by Acclaim. This was based on the arcade release of the same name, a twin-stick overhead shooter set to a then futuristic game show. You file into the arena and are immediately bum-rushed by dozens of enemies. The idea is to collect money and prizes and not perish in the process. Visually, it's nothing special, but it's incredible fun that supports 2 players. Item power-ups appear frequently, and you get multiple routes to take. Nasty boss battles await you at the end of every level, and the later stages become nothing short of a frantic race to outrun endless waves of bad guys. The Super Nintendo controller was perfectly suited for the action as well. The cross pattern of the buttons allowed you a great amount of control over your shots. The Genesis version didn't look, sound, or play nearly as well, making the Super Nintendo edition an easy alternative for the most die-hard Sega fan. In April of 1992, the Super Nintendo received the much-anticipated sequel, Contra III: The Alien Wars. As a fan of the NES series, this couldn't come soon enough. Konami had been one of the go-to companies for run-and guns and shoot-em-ups for years, but they completely outdid themselves with this masterwork of gaming goodness. As in the previous Contras, aliens are wreaking havoc on mankind, and you and a friend must kick their xenomorph butts back out into space. And wow, is this one beautiful showpiece for what the Super Nintendo could give us. Killer special effects that extended well beyond the backgrounds. There are entire stages that spin and rotate thanks to the specialized functions of the platform. And boy, did the soundtrack really nail the action. Pound for pound, it's one of the premier titles in this genre and holds up as well today as it did back then. My only real complaint is that it's kinda short, but when something looks and plays as well as this, wanting more is only natural. It was just a week after Contra III when The Legend of Zelda: A Link to the Past showed up in April of 1992. It was a 1-2 punch of rare quality. This was the follow-up to the NES releases, retaining the view and play style of the very first game, but this time with a vastly superior story and presentation. Surprisingly, this is actually set before the 2 NES adventures, but still follows a similar path of our hero Link trying to stop the evil Ganon. It was so cool how the first world was only half the game, giving way to a dark mirror-like realm where things were quite different. There's pendants to find, a master sword to wield, and a princess to rescue, leading to hours of incredible gameplay. Some consider it one of the best games ever made. I won't go that far, but I still think it's a must-play and an absolute gem that did the Super Nintendo proud. April of 1992 wasn't done dropping the hits because we also got Top Gear, a racing game from Gremlin Interactive. This is very similar to the Lotus series of racing titles, and I really enjoyed its presentation and gameplay. It runs unbelievably well for a split-screen engine, and the sense of depth in the oncoming road is really well done. There's loads of tracks and each car has different attributes to consider. There's also various terrain you'll navigate. I usually despise split-screen engines during this era because it always meant the visuals were heavily compromised, but this just isn't the case with this one. It was extremely successful on the Super Nintendo and spawned multiple sequels. If you enjoyed the Lotus titles on the Genesis or Amiga, be sure to give this classic a try. In July of 1992, Capcom brought home the very first port of Street Fighter II to home consoles in the US, and its effect on the appeal of the platform cannot be denied. The massive popularity of this one helped Nintendo keep pace with Sega's success in the West. To be able to play Street Fighter II at home on the Super Nintendo first was a massive win, and skyrocketed the platform to the top of every kid's list across the world. And rightfully so. It was nothing short of an outstanding port from hardware radically superior in every way. The sprites are a tad smaller, and there are some animation cuts, but this still is such a great title. It felt like the arcade, and that's what was really important. It would go on to sell exceptionally well, and is one of the top performing software releases for the console. You can of course pick it apart in a side-by-side today, but at the time, it really was a winner. The magic of 1992 kept on coming in August with the release of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles: Turtles in Time. This was Konami's home conversion of the arcade adventure of the same name, and very similar to the Street Fighter II port, the quality is exceptional. The sound and visuals nail the feel of the coin-op, and unlike Final Fight the previous year, this has all the fighters and the two-player mode. It was another release that elevated the standing of Nintendo's platform. It was a must-play for arcade goers that appreciated a good beat-em-up and motivated a generation to tell their parents, "I want a Super Nintendo for Christmas." Best part was that Konami just didn't settle for a straight port, as this contains new enemies, new boss fights, and a new area. You also have the ability to play a versus mode against another player. You may have noticed that there's a number 4 in the home title. That's because Konami had started adding numerical labels to the NES games a few years prior, leading to the home versions of Turtle in Time carrying the number 4. Back in 1992, it was about as good as this genre could get. In September of 1992, the very first Super Mario Kart was released for the Super Nintendo. I still remember vividly my best buddy Nathan getting this and playing it non-stop. I mean, he got so good at it, I had no chance of competing, and I had to hear his mouth daily about how awesome he was at it. And while I never loved it quite as much as he did, I cannot deny the massive popularity of this. Everyone had it, and it was a constant among the trading circles in my school. The Mode 7 visuals were quite eye-catching at the time, and the sound fit the presentation as well. The real standouts here were the imaginative weapons and gameplay. Nintendo added Mario-themed items that could slow down your rivals or help you, and the racing mechanics were dialed up a notch over the competition by a fun and well-executed hopping and power slide system. This first Super Mario Kart was surpassed quickly by better games in the years to come, but in 1992, it was a nearly perfect multiplayer extravaganza. Another September winner was Konami's AxSlay. This was a mixed perspective shoot 'em up with a unique weapon system. Instead of getting power-ups in the field, you get your weapons by advancing in stages. You begin with 3 that can be switched on the fly, but as you gain more, you choose which weapon you want to begin the next area, adding quite a bit of strategy and challenge depending on your choices. I'm normally disappointed by single-player shooters, but this one had such a unique look about it, I still found it quite appealing. The vertical stages use a warping technique that make it appear as though you are advancing on a spherical horizon. It was really unique and it made the Super Nintendo look like a beast compared to the traditional stuff on other home consoles. But don't go thinking that just the vertical stages were impressive, because I thought the traditional horizontal areas had some nice effects as well. Bottom line, AxSlay was an incredibly good time that was different enough from the stuff on the Genesis to really make its mark. A number of programmers here went on to form Treasure and make the 16-bit classic Gunstar Heroes the following year. In October of 1992, the Super Nintendo received a port of the helicopter action classic, Desert Strike: Return to the Gulf. I really enjoyed the Genesis version of this, and while that version will always be the best one in my eyes, the old Super Nintendo release was still a good time. This was the kind of game where the first time you played it, you went in guns blazing, and you got shot down in seconds. But each time after that, you got a bit more familiar with the landscape, how much damage you could take, and where to look for fuel and ammo. Before long, you were circling enemies, laying the beat down on their weaponry, armor, and fortifications. Spend enough time learning the ins and outs, and you could find some real long-term fun here. October also blessed us with the beat-em-up Super Double Dragon. This was not based on an arcade game and was made specifically for the home market, and it was all the better for it. The gameplay sees a number of advances over the previous arcade editions, including super moves, a block and grapple system, as well as differences in fighting styles between the two brothers. It's got 2-player co-op, a fantastic soundtrack, and the animation absolutely pisses on previous entries. It's hard though, and to truly appreciate it, you'll need to put in some practice to get the most out of it. If you do find it enjoyable, be sure to try the Japanese version called Return of Double Dragon. It has numerous differences that really make it worth checking out. Games based on a movie license got a big boost with the November 1992 release of Super Star Wars. Like most movie-to-game adaptations, this takes numerous liberties with the source material, yet still retains a familiar look and feel throughout. You play as Luke Skywalker, Han Solo, and Chewbacca through this platforming run-and-gun hack-and-slash hybrid. You'll use blasters, lightsabers, and even a few vehicles to fly your way through most of the locations in the movie. I really loved the music here and found the graphics to be a step up from your typical movie-based fare. That was probably because I was a pretty hardcore Star Wars fan back then and the locations and characters meant the world to me. I was really excited when this got announced for the Sega CD, but that one got cancelled before it was finished. John Madden Football 93 was also released in November of 1992, and boy was I glad to see it. The year before, the Super Nintendo had butchered its first John Madden port, an awful running excuse of a game that paled beside the vastly superior Genesis release. But it was here that Electronic Arts finally delivered something that could stand on its own and represent the franchise properly. You got a nice tick up in animation quality this year, including new catch and tackle moves. There's a no-huddle offense option now, and the quarterback can spike the ball to stop the clock. It still isn't as fast or as smooth as the Genesis edition, but what's here is light years ahead of what we saw before. The only big negative I can say about this one is that it still lacks the NFL license, an issue that would not be resolved until the following year. The year ended with the release of the Magical Quest starring Mickey Mouse. Being a fan of the Disney games on the Genesis meant my ears perked up when I first heard about this one. The Sega-made Mickey games tended to be fantastic, and this was done by none other than Capcom themselves, so I knew chances were good it'd be a winner. For some reason, the dastardly Emperor Pete has kidnapped Pluto, and it's up to Mickey to get him back. This one relies on outfits to add substantial gameplay variety to what is otherwise a pretty traditional platformer. Mickey can use a magician's outfit to shoot magic, a firefighter's outfit to shoot water, and he can get climbing gear to negotiate certain surfaces. The Magical Quest is also a nice looking and sounding release that uses the Super Nintendo to paint a lush world full of life and excellent animation. It's a tad short and doesn't have the co-op multiplayer of World of Illusion, but this is still a challenging and fun release that holds up well today. I wasn't the only one to think so, because it spawned 2 additional sequels in the following years. You want to know what's funny about this episode? Despite covering 13 very good games, I didn't touch upon many others that made 1992 special on the Super Nintendo. There was the shoot 'em up from Jellico called Earth Defense Force. There was Data East arcade port of Joe and Mac. There was Super Adventure Island from Hudson Soft. Technosoft released the shooter Thunder Spirits. Konami had Legend of the Mystical Ninja. Mario Paint showed up for the kiddies. Space Megaforce was a compound shooter set in the Alesta series of games. And there were lots more beyond those. The massive popularity of the Super Famicom in Japan meant that the platform saw a huge amount of third-party support that transitioned into Western markets, something that wasn't nearly as prevalent on Sega's 16-bit platform. In fact, it took companies like Capcom and Konami years to start bringing their wares to the Genesis, with many others remaining 100% loyal to Nintendo, so the Super NES remained an absolute must-own for me, even with my Sega fandom in full bloom. It was this time, this era of gaming, where we saw what can only be described as the best competition the hobby has ever seen. We had 2 radically different hardware makers creating very different games, and a slew of third parties between them often doing the same. That made the 16-bit days an exciting time of always wanting to see what was on both consoles. If you owned just one, you made sure to get yourself to a friend's house often to play the other. We all had our favorites and argued their merits amongst our peers, but the honest truth was, the variety and differences between Sega and Nintendo made the 4th generation of consoles a truly special time. I'm Sega Lord X. Thank you guys for watching, and I will catch you next time.